Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our first webinar of this series on combating invasive weed species. My name is Ellen Crane. I'm the Extension Coordinator with the Beef Cattle Research Council, and I will be your moderator for tonight. This webinar should last approximately 1 hour, but can go a bit longer depending on the number of questions that you have for us during the question and answer period at the end of the presentation. If you're on Twitter, you can follow along with us using the hashtag BeefWebinar. We are recording this session, and I will email this link out to those that have registered in a couple of days. So if you miss anything or you want to hear something again, you can go back and check on that. Of course, you'll be able to hear and see tonight's presenters, but we can't hear or see you. If you have any questions or you want to communicate with us, you can type into the question window that's at one of the controls in your screen, and we can answer those questions for you. If your internet connection is a bit slow tonight, it might help to close some other programs that are using your internet. You may also want to close the webcam video, which means you won't be able to see us, but you'll be able to hear the presentation. So with that, let's get started. This is what we will be covering tonight. You will hear from 3 presenters that will be talking about combating invasive weed species across the country. I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker. Our first speaker will be John Duynisveld. John has been a beef researcher at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Japan for the last 21 years. His ongoing research includes the effect of forage species on beef productivity, the effect of bioactive forages on animal production, and extending the grazing season. His family farm raises grass-fed beef, sheep, and pork, and free-range chickens and turkeys. Between his research career and cattle herd at home, John has been using fall and winter grazing for over 19 years. Tonight, John will be speaking about pasture management as a tool for managing invasive weeds. And with that, I'll hand things over to you, John.
Okay, well, thank you, Ellen, and thanks for the opportunity to speak on this evening. Pasture is something that's I take a lot of interest in. I've been involved with pasture, I guess, since I started my master's with Dr. Alan Ferdine back in '95. And there's always so much more to learn about pasture management. So this evening I'm going to talk about pasture management and how we can use that as a tool for managing invasive weeds. It's not something I've done direct research on, but it's one of those things that over the course of the last 25 years, it's definitely something you encounter, and something that, you know, I've had some successes and failures both on my own farm at home as well as on the research farm at Japan. So this evening, I'm just going to give a little brief overview of kind of what I see a weed as, and kind of maybe what a weed isn't as well. And talk just briefly about how we can use pasture management to minimize our chances of having invasive weed issues, because it's always nicer to prevent a problem than to have to treat it. And I'll talk a bit about using some pasture management to manage invasive weeds, and this would sort of be as an alternative to maybe using things like chemicals or tillage or sort of higher input, higher cost type approaches to managing weeds. And then I want to touch a bit on using different livestock species to cope with weeds as well. So I think there's some opportunities there for producers in some situations, and it's something that can work quite well. So what exactly is a weed? And, you know, different people have different definitions on this. Some people in the grazing world I've talked to, they really don't feel there's any such thing as a weed. There's just, you know, different plants, and animals will choose to eat them based on whether, you know, what their needs are, or they choose not to eat them. But essentially, how I kind of look at it is a weed is a plant that's growing somewhere that you don't want it to grow. If you're talking to like a crop farmer who grows corn and soybeans, and they could have a beautiful field of soybeans growing, but if there's a bunch of corn plants from volunteer corn that's growing up in there, then that corn would be a weed, even though they might have a field next door that is a cornfield. So this is something that's going to cause them some grief somewhere down the road. Sometimes too, like weeds can be something that's perfectly palatable to grazing animals, could be very nutritious, very something they love to eat, but it might be something that's crowding out a more productive species. And something like dandelions are an example of this. I've always been, kind of fond of dandelions as far as being a species that animals seem to enjoy grazing in the spring. But then a couple of years ago, I was reading an article from a journal over in Ireland, and they were talking about the lost productivity you get from having too many dandelions in a pasture, and how they're, the way that they grow, they crowd out your grasses or legumes that give you more seasonal productivity than a dandelion that really produces a lot of growth in the spring. So, perspective matters on these things. Some weeds might be poisonous or totally unpalatable to animals, and therefore taking up valuable space. So, poisonous ones definitely we have risks with. There's things like tansy ragwort, choke cherries. There's a variety of different ones that fit that category. Unpalatable ones can be things like Canada thistle, bull thistle, different rose bushes, things like that animals just prefer not to eat if given a choice. And the other thing about a weed is they often can come to dominate a pasture if conditions permit that. So, and again, they're taking out your species that may be either more productive or meet more of what your animal's nutritional needs are. But the other thing to remember about a weed is that really they're often just a symptom of our management or maybe our mismanagement. And then that's what, the first thing I want to kind of focus on is how we can try to manage our pasture so we minimize the chance of having invasive weeds come in. Because again, if you can avoid that problem and not have to treat it, it's going to be less costly in the long run. Not unlike vaccinating cattle to avoid shipping fever, things like that. It's just a whole lot easier if you don't have to go down the road of treatment. So, it's pretty simple to say that if you don't want to have weeds in your pasture, you want to just maintain a really strong stand of your desirable grasses and legumes. And, in theory, that's just common sense. But when we look at things like, our grazing season has sort of high points and low points, just sort of from spring through to fall and through winter if you're doing winter grazing. Then we have, we sort of have our average weather for a given region, but we never get average weather. We get, we get dry weather, we get wet weather. We don't get an average year very, very often. So all these things influence both how our grasses grow, how our animals behave, and how the animals have an impact on the grasses and the soils. But essentially, in the last 25 years of working with pasture management in various capacities, there's sort of two things that I see that are really key in helping to minimize the occurrence of invasive weeds in pastures, and that's to avoid overgrazing and to try and avoid having mud. Because both overgrazing and having mud gives a chance for seeds that maybe you haven't planted, seeds that you don't want to kind of come in and start to take hold and potentially start to dominate your pasture. Another little issue that shows up sometimes and is fertility issues. Sometimes can lead to your more desirable species being less competitive, and especially in Eastern Canada, if make sure your pH is being close to that 6 to 6.5 range, just because it does help our more desirable species tend to be a whole lot more competitive that way. So that's the one thing that really has I've noticed over the years being sort of one of the bigger issues on soil fertility. But I mean, again, I'm going to focus mostly on the pasture management. So this is an example of an overgrazed pasture. This pasture picture was taken in it'd be mid-October, probably 3 or 4 years ago. Nice early morning pasture picture. You can tell by the long shadow here. But if you look at this pasture, for a pasture that should be getting ready for winter, here in the Maritimes, our grass will keep growing right up into late October, early November. But there's really not a lot of cover here, not a lot of leaf for the plants to be able to get a strong root to be able to do well in the getting ready for winter, overwintering, and then being able to get a good early start in the spring. And with a pasture like this, you will often see, especially if there's any added stresses of freeze thaw over the winter or things like that, you'll see the opportunity for weeds to move in. And, and because of the fact that these grasses are likely not going to get going early in the spring, if the seeds are present, and they can fairly quickly show their head. this is an example from my own farm. You know, sometimes you get these forecasts in the rain where they say, you know, you're going to have 10 to 15 millimeters of rain overnight, and there's a risk of thunder showers, and you could have higher local amounts in thunder showers. Well, our 10 to 15 millimeters of rain in this particular case turned out to be about 110 millimeters of rain, and I had about 250 head of cattle in this 2.5 acre paddock, and this was the result. You know, not at all ideal. Now the pasture did recover, but it did take some time. And you think about every single one of these little hoof prints. That's the place where the grass or legumes that I was trying to carefully manage were severely damaged. There's a lot of compaction there. There's a lot of soil disturbance, and that's the sort of place where you'll see a lot of weeds move in. Things, in particular, things like bull thistle, Canada thistle, plantain. They tend to be really good at filling in on these pugging type issues that you see from grazing when it's wet. And this is sort of my third sort of more ideal scenario. This is again a sort of a late fall picture. This would be sort of late September, early October. We haven't had too much of a frost yet. The trees haven't started to turn. But you can see here the cattle have just moved into this paddock. It's a nice strong paddock. There's lots of leaf. You know, there's lots for the animals to eat. But the grasses and the legumes that you see here, they're really in just well rested, just kind of at that point they want to be grazed or they're ready to be grazed. But then the paddock that they just moved out of here, you can see there's plenty of leaf left behind, so that those, even though we're into fall, they're still able to catch some sunshine to be able to get ready for winter, and they should be able to have a good strong start in the spring, which will minimize that chance of having weeds move in here. So, you know, and help maintain this sort of more ideal type of a pasture. So again, we want to try to maintain something like that, which can ideally keep us from having to deal with the weed issue in the first place. But you know, as the situation, sometimes, you know, things happen, and you know, and weeds can move in. I've had some pretty significant infestations of Canada thistle in particular, and I think that's something that people can relate to across most of Canada. That the Canada thistle is one of those weeds that is pretty, once it gets a foothold, it's pretty quick to spread if conditions allow, and it also is very invasive in the sense that you can have a plant and they have quite an extensive root system, and that mother plant can have little offshoots that can go, you know, 5, 10, 15 feet away, and it'll pop up and there'll be another plant, and so your thistles can spread quite quickly, and anywhere that they sort of have that opportunity to catch a little bit of sunshine, you can have another thistle plant come up. So there's a variety of ways that people can choose to deal with invasive weeds like this. Clipping is something that, you know, we've tried and works well. I know a lot of people who have tried spot spraying. So if you have a sort of a clump of weeds, well, you might just spray that area to try to minimize the opportunity for the weeds to spread. You can use weed wipers. I don't know how extensively they're used across Canada. I know several people that have used them successfully in pastures here. They use them a lot in blueberry fields in Nova Scotia. So, you know, it's sort of this little wick that lets you set it up higher than your preferred species, and usually your weeds will be growing taller, so it allows you to apply chemical right to the weeds. But I'm really a big fan of trying to use the animals to solve your problem that way. So, and a really bit of interesting Canadian research from 2005 was done out in Alberta to try and control Canada thistle, and that was by Bruin and Bork. And it's I don't know, I've always found this quite an interesting paper, and it's one that I've found repeatable very well, at least in my own situation. But they showed that 2 intense grazings per year over 2 to 3 years can nearly eliminate Canada thistle from an infested pasture. And they were starting with some pretty high levels of Canada thistle in some of these examples. So this is something that I've applied by using high stock density grazing. So this is a picture here. Actually, it comes from my daughter's grade 11 science fair project. She did some animal behavior work with high stock density grazing. But here we have a herd of about 110 head that are being moved 6 times a day on about a little under 1/4 of an acre, probably about 0.2 acres that each of their allotments would be. So that's about 700,000 or 800,000 pounds of beef per acre. And I'm just going to go through a series of pictures here to show sort of the impact that has on on the pasture. But I've successfully used this to control things like Canada thistle, bull thistle, tansy ragwort, and buttercup, and it seems to be quite effective. You don't eliminate them, but you eliminate 90% of them, which is kind of I think meets my goal. So before you go into a high stock density, you want to have a pasture that's ready to graze. So you don't want to have that really short continuous graze pasture. That's well, your cows don't have much to eat when you start doing a high stock density grazing. But you want the grass to be strong. You want it to have a good leaf and a good root system so that it's able to handle the grazing and able to recover quickly. So this is what some of the thistles look like after you go through and into a patch that's a fair bit of thistle. You can see that the cows have had an impact on this. There's not too many leaves left on this particular thistle. Here's another, some more examples. You can see that in some of these cases, not necessarily that the cows have eaten the tops. They might have chewed them off and spit them out, or it might have been some hoof action that broke them off. You'll see, there's a bit of manure all spread around here. All this helps. Here's another thistle stalk that broke off. Some of the ones in this example here, I'm guessing the cows probably might have eaten that, decided they didn't want to eat it, so they left it behind. But we've got a pretty good cover here. It was very tall when we went in, but we didn't graze it right to the ground. We've tried to leave a bit of leaf behind so that our plants can grow back quickly. Just to show we don't get perfect control this way. This is where one of our cross fences went, so there wasn't as much hoof action and intensity from the livestock. So you can see these thistles, they'll live to fight another day. But what's remarkable with this high stock density grazing, when you have a pasture that's ready, this is what your regrowth will look like 3 days later, or 3 weeks later, excuse me. It's just incredible when the conditions are right, and you can apply this sort of management, how quickly your desired species of grass and legume will come back in to fill in the holes, and then they will outcompete the weeds that you don't want there, because you've tried to manage so that those desirable species are in their ideal state to be able to grow back quickly, and hopefully they will be growing back more quickly than your invasive weed. So sort of some of the keys to have success using high stock density grazing to control weeds. You don't want to do it when the soil's too wet, because you're really concentrating those animals in one spot, and that can be a little disastrous, especially if you get another rain on top of it. You need your desired plants, your grasses and legumes, to be at a growing point where they have a lot of leaf, they have a strong root, and this will allow for a much quicker regrowth. And along that vein, you want to make sure you leave enough residual leaf for these desired plants to continue to capture the sunlight, continue to grow, continue to feed the roots and the soil biology, and everything grows back so fast. The other thing that I've found is, if you're going to use this approach, it works best when you have good growing conditions. It'll work moderately effectively in a drought condition, but then your desired plants aren't likely going to grow back as well, and sometimes actually your weeds might be the ones that are a little more aggressive in a drought condition. The same thing is sort of at the end of a growing season. Sometimes your desired species are getting themselves ready for winter rather than getting ready to grow back and fill back in again. So I find it works best sort of in mid-season in a year when growing conditions are normal. The other thing is I find it's you can get away with like a 1 or 2 day grazing period, and it'll be moderately effective, but the quicker you can get them on and off, so like 1 day or less, the more effective, the more rapidly you're going to get the response that you're looking for. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here now and talk about multi-species grazing to manage weeds as well. I've got some experience grazing a lot of different animals, and every animal kind of grazes in its own different way. A cow kind of sticks her tongue out and wraps it around the grass and pulls it against her bottom teeth and kind of tears it off. And I kind of liken them to be like a bush cutter. They're not terribly selective. They kind of rip the grass off and go with it. You take a sheep, they have a much smaller nose. They're able to be much more effective, and they actually bite the grass off. They're kind of like a little pair of hand pruners that you might use to prune bushes in the garden. You got sort of the one sharp side and the one blunt side, the ample shears, and they're pretty good at kind of picking what they want. And if you want to take it a step further, you go to chickens or turkeys, and they're incredibly effective at just picking exactly what they want and leaving behind every bit of stem, and so they can really get what they need. Different animals also can have different tolerances to toxic compounds. Sheep can successfully graze tansy ragwort, which is poisonous to cattle, there's not a lot of examples like that, but this is sheep can be quite effective for that, and it have been used in many cases to help control some of these sort of noxious type weeds. Different animals also, they just have different nutritional needs that they try to meet on pasture, so they often eat different plants. So it's just, you know, depending upon the species you have available, there's opportunities here to work that way. This is a picture, this is another late fall grazing. So this would be mid-November. It's actually a mixed cool season pasture that was predominantly orchard grass and white clover, but you can see the pH got a little bit low in this soil. It's about 5.7, so we were a little lacking in calcium, and dandelions started to move in, and they got quite heavy here. And again, like I'm not at all being dismissive of dandelions, or they do provide good quality feed at certain times of the year, but they do crowd out some of your other species, and you can see they got to be quite heavy here. But I have got these little sheep, and sheep are really effective. They really like broadleaf weeds, broadleaf plants in general. So that's, they like clovers. They eat grass as well too, but they don't like coarser grasses. They're, and again, they're good at selecting. But you can look now in this particular picture. So we see some nice white clover over here. We do see a little bit of plantain here. We see some nice grasses here. All of this is very lush, but the sheep, they target dandelions. They'll do this in the fall, they do this in the spring. They love to eat dandelions. And so this is the sort of you saw the before, this is sort of the midpoint with the sheep grazing. So this is what it looked like after the sheep were done grazing this. You can see where the dandelions were. There's really not a whole lot of dandelion left behind. But you can see the grass also has been left with enough of a leaf, enough cover that it should still be okay going through the winter. And if we take a little bit closer look, you can see where the actual dandelions were, and you can see that the sheep have literally grazed the dandelions to the ground. And this also can give you a perspective on just how much crowding these dandelions were doing, because their leaf would have been flattened across these parts of the bare dirt, and then that was keeping some of our other grasses from growing. So when I look at something like this for post grazing going into the winter, this is a chance to maybe broadcast a little bit of a legume seed you get a good seed soil contact here, so you have a chance maybe to really encourage something like a clover or a trefoil to come in here and fill in where these dandelions are going to be weakened coming in the spring. So kind of a win-win sort of opportunity here. So anyway, to kind of sum up my part of things, in order to help control or manage invasive weeds, good pasture management is the best point to minimize the opportunity for the weeds to move in. High stock density grazing is really, I think, a very powerful tool to help control weeds, especially when weeds are starting to dominate a pasture. It's just I found it to be highly effective, and it works with a variety of weeds that way. And sometimes there's opportunities to use alternative livestock species, and they're a very economical way to help control invasive weeds as well. So I'm going to leave it at that and stop the screen share. I think I was close to my allotted time too.
I believe so. Thank you so much, John. Okay, and if you thought of any questions for John, you can type those into the chat and we will answer those all at the end of the hour. So our next speaker will be Mike Cowbrough. He has been the weed specialist in field crops for the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs since 2002. His work focuses on providing tools and resources to help Ontarians manage weeds. He obtained both a BSc in agriculture and a master's degree at the University of Guelph. In addition to his role with the ministry, Mike also has an adjunct faculty status in the Department of Plant Agriculture at the University of Guelph. He resides on his family farm northwest of Guelph with his wife and his daughter. And tonight, Mike will be speaking about empowering you to be your own on-farm weed scientist. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Mike.
Perfect, Ellen. Thanks a lot. Yeah, what I want to do over the next 15 minutes is really get you excited about tackling some of these issues from a exploratory perspective. The more field-specific intelligence we can collect, the more successful we're going to be at weed management on our operations. We all come from diverse backgrounds, different operations, different challenges, and I want to focus on 3 areas of knowledge acquisition that if we can do that well, we'll have a better chance of being successful. And so start with the first point, which is being able to identify those undesirable plants. And so here's an example of an extremely toxic plant when consumed, spotted water hemlock. Thankfully, a fairly rare plant species, but I think we all encounter those species that you observe in a landscape and go, you know, what the heck is that? You pass it around to other people you trust, and they, you know, one person gives you one answer, another person gives you another answer that are conflicting, and you're kind of looking for some clarity. And so fairly recently, there's a new laboratory founded by a couple of people at the University of Guelph called harvestgenomics.ca. And one of the neat things they can do is take plant specimens, right? So kind of toonie sized leaf blades from grasses or a single broadleaf plant or weed, and they do DNA barcoding, and they're able to identify the plant species. So for about $20 a species, you grab a plant material, you send it to them, and within 3 to 5 days, they can do an accurate identification. I've used it actually a fair bit this past season to identify young grassy species in different pasture and forage settings. So, you know, that's step number one in terms of utilizing some newer technology that's fairly cost effective and accurate. Then we get into the acquisition of knowledge around those undesirable species. And so that's really getting a good handle of knowing the life cycle. And then more importantly, the time at which key growth stages of these bad plants happen. So deliberately on the screen, when I show you photos of weeds, in this case, bull thistle, I'm going to be deliberately showing you the date and the stage. And the reason I do that is, you know, the more photos of species at different stages and documenting the time, then I'm starting to acquire a whole bank of knowledge around what makes that species tick. And I can identify on my own field operation the vulnerable times, or the most kind of the vulnerable times for that weed, that if I do clipping, if I do even selective spot spraying or grazing, that I'm more likely to control that species. And I find the smartphone, for me, I'm a visual learner, or at least I like to collect data visually. The smartphone, having the shared location services on with my camera, now I can start taking a bunch of pictures, and then I can load it up into my mapping system that I know exactly where in the field, or close to where in the field, those species are, what stage they're at and at what date those stages exist. And so that's pretty powerful information to start collecting for your own operation, because, you know, bull thistle is going to grow differently in Ontario than, you know, British Columbia. And then, you know, just tackling more on the life cycle and the importance of kind of knowing how species tick. And John certainly covered parts of that, right? Like from an annual weeds perspective, it's all about seed, right? And so limiting seed recruitment. So if I'm a weed on the floor of the pasture ground, from my perspective, if I'm looking up at the sky, I'm going to have a greater chance of germinating and emerging if I have an environment like the left-hand side on your screen there, like plenty of sunlight, plenty of warmth, plenty of moisture. You know, that's maybe a pasture that's been overgrazed. That's maybe those muddy areas. Life is good. But if I'm an annual species that's trying to germinate on the right-hand side, you know, there's competition for heat and light and moisture. You know, that is certainly suboptimal. And then, you know, documenting plants that you don't care for, that you want to manage over the duration of the year, are also important then to see those key stages around, you know, when is it flowering? When is it setting seed? You know, the example in this slide here is of Eastern Black Nightshade. The picture is taken on September 5th. Those berries are mature. Any management at this stage is only going to spread the seed around. Whereas if I identify those calendar dates when it's, you know, flowering or pre-flowering, starting to set seed, I can make a plan to manage around those dates and hit it at the right time. If we move to biennial and perennial plants, you know, the challenge there with biennials and perennials, of course, is they have two ways to reproduce. They spread seed and they They use root propagates to spread and create new cohorts. So we want to limit seed production and reduce root mass. And that requires us to manage it multiple times during the season, be it with livestock, be it with clipping, herbicides, whatever. So if we look at something like Canada thistle, in the spring and the summer, the plant's focusing its energy on producing seed. That's its goal. Most weeds, they want to leave a legacy. They want to create progeny for next year. In the fall, though, the energy shifts its focus. Once that plant feels like it's set seed, then it's going to focus its energy on beefing up that root system so that it can overwinter and last into next year. And so, that is clearly a picture of Canada thistle on your screen. Interestingly, that photo is one of this year that where I mowed it down around mid-July. The plant was the patches of plants were at full flower, just slightly approaching seed production. I mowed at that stage. The plant kind of felt like it had already then dispersed seed. It didn't branch out and regrow new flowering shoots. And so that's good. I've limited seed production. Now I'm going to experiment with spot applications of herbicides like clopyralid, the active ingredient in Montrell, to see if I can reduce that biomass in the really problem areas. Again, with biennials and perennials, it's often a two-pronged approach, right? Limiting seed production, reducing root mass, so that the plant has challenges overwintering effectively. And then the last point, so once we've identified species or taken the time to capture what we have in our fields, once we've taken lots of good notes and images around when they're at different stages and when they're reproducing, the third critical aspect is to test different management tactics on a small scale so that you can see what's effective and what's not, and then scale up, as opposed to reading literature from other jurisdictions, trying it on a large scale and finding out that, hey, it doesn't really work well in my environment. So here's an example of garlic mustard that was invading a pasture. And, we worked with the producer to look at some of the products they had in their chem storage. We did some small spray bottle, pray and spray, as I sometimes call it, to see kind of what worked on the garlic mustard and left the desirable plants alone. Of course, you can also do that with non-chemical methods, like trying to pinpoint that time when mowing is most effective and will reduce seed spread and maximize biomass control. And so on that, we're going to just shift focuses then around on the management side to general rules that around limiting seed production. What timing should we focus on if our goal is to try and reduce the amount of seed that undesirable plant is producing? And so I think this varies quite a bit from species to species, or at least it can. So it's always best to test out on your own operation. But I want to draw from a recent grad student at the University of Guelph who wanted to find this out for the carrot and parsley family, and specifically a giant hogweed, a poisonous plant that we have across the country. And so her goal in this research was to focus on, when can I cut that plant so that I stop it from trying to regrow, produce new flower heads, and then set seed. And so she initiated 3 times of cutting. The first was cutting before flowering, so what you see here in this forage field. The second stage was cutting at peak flowering, so 90% of the flowers on the plants were white and there was pollination going on. And then the last stage was cutting at the beginning of seed set. So that's just at that stage where the white flowers have gone away, and now there's these green bulbous seed heads forming. So the plant's just starting to set seed. And so kind of the idea here is, can you trick something like giant hogweed into thinking that it's set seed, cut it off, and then it won't regrow and produce seed? And this chart here, this table, shows the results of Megan's work, which was if you left giant hogweed on its own, an individual plant would produce close to 4,000 seeds. If you cut it off prior to flowering, the plants did regrow. They flowered again. They produced seed, but they certainly produced less, 90 seeds per plant on average. If you waited a little longer, cut it at peak flowering, again, those plants did regrow. Not all of them, but most of them did. And now seed was down to about 40 seeds per plant. But if you waited to that it's a small window, but if you waited to the beginning of seed set, the plants did not regrow. No seeds were produced. And kind of the nice thing about this plant, giant hogweed in particular, is it's a perennial that once it does flower, or at least thinks it flowers, and has set seed, it doesn't continue to live the next year, like the plant is dead. And so you kind of use this as maybe your guiding principle to time mowing operations in a pasture to limit seed production. Of course, you want to be plant specific, species specific, because it doesn't always, there are exceptions, of course. Here's an example from this past year where there is this species here, night flowering catchfly, a kind of a unpalatable, sticky plant that not a lot of livestock like to necessarily feed on. The land manager was, looking at mowing and wanted to mow, early flowering. And so we tried it out on a small scale, and you can see on the right-hand side, when it was mowed at just, early flowering, just as plants were starting to flower, it actually, as often can happen with weeds, branched out, and it actually produced about 3 times the amount of flowers than doing nothing. So sometimes, that's again why I go back to point number 3 of trying things out on a small scale at different stages to see what's most effective. Because in this particular case, the energy, this you would have been better off staying in bed as opposed to mowing it at that stage, because we tripled flowering and didn't really have any impact on seed production. Moving to giant hogweed, here's an example where we find it in pastures. In this particular instance, there was a few amount of plants, so the landowner thought, well, let's dig up the taproot and kill these few plants. And the challenge with a weed like giant hogweed, and that's again why it's important to know the kind of biology of these species, how they reproduce. It's got a massive taproot. You can see on your screen there, it's about 60 centimeters deep. This weed's an awful lot like a dandelion, right? You pretty much have to get the entire root or else it's going to grow back. And of course, it did grow back. And so fine, no harm, no foul. We looked at this on a small scale. So now that we have this giant hogweed plant, let's try a non-selective herbicide like glyphosate. And glyphosate's actually very effective on giant hogweed. So the landowner used it here. But if we come back in about 60 days, the challenge with using non-selective herbicides like glyphosate as spot applications is you take out some of the desirable vegetation. We created a perfect environment for new seedlings to germinate and recruit. And so again, you've made the problem worse here unless you take the time to come back and do reconnaissance on those seedlings. So again, because it was done on a small scale, the impact wasn't horrific, but certainly you easily can see what works well and what doesn't work as well. We've run into in the province of Ontario this species wild chervil that's showing up a little bit more in pasture lands. It's from the same family as giant hogweed, the parsley carrot family. In April and September, it's actually at its most palatable. It could be grazed. Grazing would be an effective way to limit that species. And probably April might be a little bit too early because the pasture might not be ready. September would be a nicer window because you can, if you're grazing the biomass of that, it's less energy to the roots and you might have challenges overwintering. But if we look at that species, because it germinates, it grows fairly early in the spring. By the time we get to late May, early June, it's beginning to flower. By the time we get to mid-June, it's in full flower. this might be a good time to go in and do mowing. So again, just trying to illustrate examples of where we take photos of date and time and stage, we can kind of look and see how we could initiate management. So here actually would be a pretty decent time to start mowing to reduce seed spread. If we look at this particular field, by the time you get to June 27th, so 2-week window, the seed's already mature. And of course, at this stage, it would be too late. So at least now we have that local field specific knowledge by where we can evaluate the optimal window to manage wild chervil in this field through clipping or mowing tool. And then lastly, I'll just end with, and John touched on tansy ragwort. It's the one poisonous plant in pastures that I've probably done the most amount of work on. I will say in general with poisonous plants, this picture kind of captures my experience in that if livestock have the abundance of other species to eat, they generally aren't going to touch the poisonous ones. That's no reason not to manage them. And I think John laid out nicely, like if you can get 90% control of any species, you're doing pretty awesome. But certainly we wanted to look at ways to manage this so as to eliminate the risk, because as John mentioned, toxic to some livestock, cattle, horses. Our interest in this in particular was that there's 4 herbicides that list the species on their label as being controlled. They range significantly in price. Do they all work well? And then how do they work well if you have a small population compared to maybe doing some mechanical removal of plants? And, again, because we had taken a lot of notes and photos of the site, we knew early May was our window to tackle young plants at the stage where they're most susceptible according to the label. And the last slide I'll show here before I turn it over to Renny is this is our results of 2 years of work on tansy ragwort control. Unlike giant hogweed, which has a massive deep root system, tansy ragwort's root system was relatively shallow by comparison, and we actually were able to have fairly good success digging up individual plants. Of course, it's not practical if you have thousands of plants in a big area, but in localized areas, it's maybe an effective way if you are herbicide adverse. Interestingly enough, though, of the 4 products all claiming to control tansy ragwort, all at various different price points, it was really only Milestone that provided over 80% control of tansy ragwort. So kind of going back to point number 3 of looking at different management tools on a small scale on your own operation, mirroring something like this really allows you to identify things that are going to be more successful than others for your own operation. So with that, I think just to keep things on time, I'm up. My time is up. I will stop sharing my screen and I'll toss things over to Ellen.
Excellent. One comment here, Mike, I was going to tell you. Shout out to Mike from New Zealand, from Andrea Murphy. She's watching from New Zealand tonight.
Hey, Andrea, how's it going?
Okay, so next I will hand this over to Renny Grilz. Renny is the Resource Management Officer for the Meewasin Valley Authority in Saskatoon and is responsible for managing the South Saskatchewan River Valley with targeted conservation grazing, prescribed burning, restoration projects, and an extensive invasive species program in an urban and rural landscape. Renny has a degree in plant ecology from the University of Saskatchewan and sits on numerous boards, including the Society for Range Management and the Saskatchewan Invasive Species Council. Renny's career has spanned over 25 years across the 3 prairie provinces, working for Ducks Unlimited Canada, the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and the Canadian Wildlife Service. Tonight, Renny will be speaking about combating invasive weed species using multiple tools in the battle against invasive weed species. So with that, I'll hand things over to you, Renny.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, so thank you for the invite. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to the group tonight. I'm sort of my spare time, not just working at Meewasin. I also work as a weed inspector for 2 municipalities outside of Saskatoon. And so yeah, invasive species is something that consumes a lot of my work time and my spare time as well. So just a little bit about Meewasin. We're a local conservation authority based out of Saskatoon with sort of a 3-prong mandate. We're responsible for the conservation of the river valley, South Saskatchewan River Valley around Saskatoon. We provide education opportunities for people to learn about grasslands and the river valley. And then also we provide opportunities to get people in to experience the river valley and also these grassland sites. So it's a great sort of mandate to get people out onto the land and develop an appreciation for our grasslands. The valley itself is the South Saskatchewan River. We manage 6,700 hectares of land, north and south of Saskatoon, including sites within the city limits and also outside. So it's a sort of a weird or unique combination of rural grassland pastures that we manage to grassland sites within the city limits. And so we have some unique challenges that we try and deal with, and doing things like grazing within the city limits. How do you manage a herd of cattle or a flock of sheep within city limits? Provides some challenges. Plus also that influence of those, the public going onto these sites really brings a lot of presence of invasive species onto these sites as well. So Ellen, I'd asked Ellen to create a poll on invasive species for Western pastures. I did a survey of quite a few of my friends on Facebook yesterday and asked them to sort of come up with the top 10 or top 5 invasive species that they think that they feel in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba for pastures. And I had a large selection of weeds that people presented. So I originally gave Alan a list of I think it was about 40 species to select from. The poll only allows for 10. So I'd like people to just select on your properties or on your operations or lands that you manage. If you have any of those weeds on your lands, please identify them. I'm just curious what people are trying to deal with. So what I'm going to show is 5 species that I'm either dealing with or watching for here in the Saskatoon region. I know other jurisdictions are dealing with as well around in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. And just sort of want to give you an idea of what those issues are. So the first one is absinthe. So this is one of the Artemisia species. It's a biennial plant, fairly shallow rooted with a bit of a tap root, and a really prolific seed producer. Quite commonly found in road ditches, disturbed areas, but what we're really finding this species popping up in areas of hay fields, and then also in areas where deer are congregating in sort of aspen stands or wolf willow patches. And so with its large prolific seed production, it's becoming quite dominant in several pastures, especially in the parkland ecoregions of the prairies. And I think when you start looking at issues with invading hay fields or even road ditches, that there's that potential for it to move into our pastures as we're cutting these hay fields and moving hay onto our operations. I know on our family farm, we first brought it into our farm back in the early 1980s from some contaminated gravel. And so ever since then, we've been battling this species.
Renny, I have the poll results here if you'd like to see those. Oh,
perfect. You want to pop them up? So poll results, okay, absinthe, baby's breath, common burdock. Ooh, I should have covered that one. Common tansy, downy brome, leafy spurge, orange hawkweed, Russian knapweed, and yellow toadflax. Thank you very much, Alan. Thanks everyone for responding to that survey. So I'll be covering a good chunk of those species. The next one is common tansy. Common tansy is one that is really becoming a major issue in the parklands of Saskatchewan, and it's moving south into our mixed grass prairie ecoregion. And this species is a prolific seed producer. You can see those yellow floret flowers. When it produces seed, the seed will hang on through the winter and disperse across snow. It's taproot and also grows in a clump, and it keeps spreading. And as you can see in that picture with the goats, that's a community pasture northeast of Saskatoon in the parklands, where there's quarter sections that are totally dominated by this species. The species also contains alkaloids, which potentially can cause abortions in cattle. And then also there's been some work done by the Ministry of Agriculture here looking at goat grazing as a potential control. Right now, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada of Lethbridge is working on some biocontrol options for this species, but very difficult to control. And quite commonly found in road ditches and then spread from there. Next one. Downy brome. So this is an annual grass species. It's really dominant in the areas like in British Columbia, in the Okanagan in the interior, down through the Palouse Prairie in the United States and through California. It's a winter annual. The seeds usually starts growing early April, greens up right away, produces seed by middle of May into June, and then becomes a dead material. And so really highly flammable grass, really low forage productivity. It tends to start dominating stands, and also you can see those awns on those seeds creates issues for cattle. It's starting to creep into southern Saskatchewan, and we're seeing it filling in sort of those niches where there's maybe some disturbed soils. There's a lot of concern that as our winters start warming up here in the prairies, that we're going to see the species increase. I know in the Swift Current region, we're starting to see more and more of it. And so you're looking at reduced palatability, but also potentially increase in fire risk because of this species. Next one, leafy spurge. This one is sort of the juggernaut of invasive species. It is a prolific seed producer. It has an extensive taproot that goes down up to 30 feet with a rhizomatous root of up to, I think, 15 feet in either direction. And then when the seeds are ripened, they'll shoot seeds out up to 10 to 15 feet away. So it's sort of, as it becomes established, it just continues to spread. I've seen this species in the river valley here in Saskatoon growing on pure vertical sand where slumps are occurring, and it's growing in that. Where nothing else will grow, this will grow. In estimates in North Dakota, there's up to 10 million acres infested with leafy spurge. In Manitoba, there's an estimate of up to 1 million acres. Here in Saskatchewan, we don't have any estimates. In terms of control, there are many different options. A lot of herbicide, there's a few herbicide options, targeted grazing options with sheep and goats. Also, there are some biocontrol options as well with these little black beetles, leafy spurge beetles, provide an option for control. Another one that we're starting to see creep into Saskatchewan from Alberta, here in Saskatchewan, it's mainly coming in along the South Saskatchewan River system, is Russian knapweed. And there's other knapweeds as well, dotted knapweed, snapweed, diffuse knapweed, very prolific invasive species, quite common in the interior BC and the foothills of Alberta. When you look into areas like Wyoming and California, United States, lots of these knapweeds are present. As you can see, this picture is taken near Leader, Saskatchewan on the riverbank, becomes quite dominant, starts choking out other species, becomes quite bushy as well, so very difficult for livestock to get into graze. Also, the seeds will float and so easily spread. So those were just sort of 5 I picked, but there's definitely way more to be worried about. You can see on that poll there was other species. Red Bartzia is is found in the Interlake region of Manitoba, and quite common in hay fields there. And so when you start thinking about concerns of hay being cut and then transported to other parts of the prairies, especially when there's drought, potential for that species to spread. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at when should you should consider controlling invasive species. And so I quite often when I give presentations, I provide this, the next two slides of sort of when is the most effective time to deal with invasive species. And really it's that prevention. If you can keep the weeds out and make sure they don't show up on your operation, that is the best way to deal with invasives. So keep your equipment clean, make sure you have clean hay, work with your local municipality to make sure they're not spreading weeds around in their road ditches, and just that ounce of prevention can save you so much effort and over time. And then as soon as you start finding species popping up, Mike mentioned about knowing what plants, what the invasive plants are in your operation. If you've come across something that you don't know, find out what it is. And if it is an invasive species, start dealing with it as soon as you can. And so if you get into that early eradication stage where you find it, you get on top of it, you deal with those little tiny patches, eliminate from your operation, you'll take you less time, less effort, and you'll have less impact on your productivity of your ranch. However, over time, you'll see these populations spread, and if you don't control, and so then it becomes into a containment stage. It gets so large that you may not be able to eradicate it from your place, but at least you can keep it contained into certain portions of the ranch. And then eventually you may get to a situation where you're overran with that species. There's several, there's a gentleman back home where my family farm is, and he has 2 quarter sections full of common tansy, and his productivity is so low from a grazing perspective that he finds the pastures relatively worthless. So it becomes such an issue where, what do you do next? Do you rip up the pasture and reseed it, or do you just even sometimes walk away? This graphic is very similar, and looking at your effectiveness and your cost. And so if you deal with it right away, your effectiveness goes up and your costs stay down. As you deal with larger and more larger populations of infestation, it takes a lot more effort, a lot more time, a lot more planning, and your costs go up as well. So prioritization of invasives, of how to deal with a patch. So quite often when you start finding invasive species on your operations or on your lands, it becomes a quite daunting task. You don't know where to start. How do you deal with it? Quite a few, it's not for the faint at heart to start dealing with weeds. So if sometimes you have to look at it as a battle or as a war. You can't just run in there headstrong and take them on. You got to sort of pick away and work at it. So I came across this graphic a while ago, and I think it's a really good approach on how to deal with these really infestations. Is you start picking off those small outliers, those low density patches, those individual weeds, and pick away at those and get rid of them, and then start working your way to the center. And maybe there's different tools that you can use within those densities. So those outliers, maybe that's where you do your spot spraying. Your really dense patches, maybe that's where you target maybe your targeted grazing or your biocontrols. And then those middle areas, maybe you start looking at different tools as well. And so you just sort of start looking at it and pick away at it slowly. One thing you do have with invasive species, you do have time. You don't have to quickly run out there and deal with it right now. If you take a strategic approach and work away at it, you could sometimes be more effective with dealing with that. And so, yeah, what I find is, taking out those outliers first and then working your way in. Because if you go into that big patch at the very beginning, you'll feel defeated, you'll give up, and you'll run away screaming. And so, if you really work at it, you can maybe get yourself ahead of it. So, John talked about this, and Mike talked about this as well. There's not just one tool for dealing with invasives; it's multiple tools, and it depends what you have in your toolkit, how you're set up in your operation, what you have available, and looking at different ways of dealing with invasives. So taking that integrated approach, not one tool is the best, and you may have to look at multiple tools. So targeted grazing, and depending on what the species is of weed, some weeds you can't graze with cattle, some are maybe more suited for sheep or goats. And if you have that opportunity, if like say if you have a leafy spurge infestation and you do have sheep or goats on your operation, maybe you can incorporate them into targeting those leafy spurge patches. Or if you maybe have a neighbor that maybe has a few goats, you can maybe work with them and develop a relationship there and maybe use them to target. Good old hand removal. That's what I find summer students are really good for. And it builds, I tell them it builds character to go out there and start dealing with invasive species. And depending on what the species is, sometimes if you're trying to do hand removal, just digging them out, you break that root off like that giant hogweed, just makes it mad, right? And it just flourishes even more. But for some species, it can be quite effective. It's also very good if you have opportunities with, depending if you work for an agency, volunteers love to get out and deal with invasive species. And so hand removal is an option. Biocontrol, depending where you are and what the weeds are. Weed species are, there might be some biocontrol options. Here in Saskatchewan, leafy spurge beetles are fairly popular as a biocontrol option. There is a release site west of Regina that for leafy spurge beetles where people across the province go every July and collect leafy spurge beetles and then re-release them on their sites. Biocontrol options are not a quick solution. It's sort of looking at it as a marathon. It takes multiple years of control. And typically with biocontrols, where you re-release them, they'll deal with those species, those populations there and slowly spread out. They won't eliminate all the weeds, but they'll maybe tackle, they'll eat a certain percentage, or they'll deal with a certain percentage of the weeds in that spot. But if it is an option on your to access biocontrols, it's always something to look at, especially in those really dense patches or those back areas where you can't get in there to do other control methods. Herbicides, that's my go-to option. In the back of my truck during the field season, I carry up to 3 different hand sprayers with 3 different herbicides. If I come across a patch of weeds, I use the right herbicide that's registered for spraying that site or for that weed, and I'll try and hit those little patches as fast as I can. And so you have different options. You have hand sprayers, you have quad sprayers, you have wickers, you have high clearance sprayers, and it depends on what your weed situation is, your comfort level is, and then also how much funding you have available or in your operation. A lot of these herbicides can be quite expensive, especially for some of these noxious weeds. Your run-of-the-mill 2,4-D Banvils may not be as effective, and so you may need to look at some of these higher cost herbicides like Tordon or Novius for something like leafy spurge. Becomes very expensive, but they're also very effective. Mechanical removal, so that could be anything from mowing or even disking or cutting if you need to, is an option for removal. I also find creating that awareness with the public sometimes could be the most effective. And so, workshops like this, webinars like this, or getting people out on the land and seeing what weeds are. A lot of the watershed groups here in Saskatchewan, pre-COVID, were putting on annual tours of invasive species identification. And so getting people out there to see what the different weeds are, talk about different control methods, and sharing ideas and resources has been quite effective. And then that ounce of prevention. This picture here is a really bad patch of leafy spurge. The RM, or the municipality, had just mowed the ditch where it was full of leafy spurge. And so when you think about that one, that I looked at it, and there was about 10% of the flowers were already gone to seed. And so how far did that RM mower or municipality mower spread that seed? And so, that ounce of prevention sometimes could save you a lot of money and a lot of effort over time. So this is one of my sites within the city of Saskatoon. It's a grassland site with wetlands. Mike talked about mapping out invasive or your weed species. What we do is, as we are controlling our weeds, we also map it out. We take GPS points and then we provide the data to IMAP Invasives, which is the database that we use here in Saskatchewan for documenting weeds. And as you can see, we got a nice spread of invasives throughout the area. And you know, some of these are individual little spots, and then some of them are fairly large patches. And so each dot was dealt with, but sometimes with different control techniques. Some of it was maybe hand removed by like knotting thistle, maybe we're cutting them off with machetes, or hand digging them. Some of them were maybe sprayed, or maybe in the case of the leafy spurge up in this patch here, we've done a combination of targeted grazing, we've done spraying, we've done biocontrol releases, and then we've also done spot spraying. And it's one of these patches that we've been dealing with for about 10 years and throwing all the different tools that we have in our arsenal at that patch. So, you know, you look at these dots and you become quite, this is 300 hectares in size, and you go, oh my gosh, there's a lot of weeds there. But as you slowly pick away at it, you can see the effort reduce. This patch right here, this site right here, when I started with Meewasin 6 years ago, we had a really bad common tansy infestation. The first year I spent 5 full days with a backpack sprayer spraying out the common tansy. This year I spent 2 afternoons with a little hand sprayer. And so that shows over time you can be quite effective in reducing your weeds. I like sharing this example. This is a recreational area west of Regina, or sorry, east of Regina. It's managed by Saskatchewan Provincial Parks. Back in the 1980s, they had discovered leafy spurge on the site. It was about the size of a small room, and the organization at that time didn't have any capacity for dealing with weed control. In 2008, they hired a consultant to map out the leafy spurge, and they found that there was about 28 hectares of leafy spurge on the site. A buddy of mine took a job with Parks back in 2013, and so he hired the same consultant to go back out and remap the leafy spurge patches, and you could see that it had over doubled in size in that 5-year period. And so he had a major issue on himself. And so this is a map here showing this site. The light green areas were the original patches from 2008. And then you can see in 2013 how they have expanded. So this is on the right-hand side is a blow-up of this portion right in here. You can see the large patches, which were the 2008, how they had merged together. But then also you can see all the new little outliers that are popping up. And so he had to come up with a strategy on how to deal with the leafy spurge. And so one of the first things they did was they did a prescribed burn on the site. The site hadn't been grazed for multiple years. So they did prescribed burn in this south half here to clear off all the vegetation. And then they started doing quad spraying and spot spraying of these small patches. Then they also did biocontrol releases as well. And my understanding since 2013, they've pretty much dropped the density of leafy spurge on the site by about 90%. But they took a very aggressive approach, but they also took a strategic approach as well. But by mapping and understanding where the spread was, it sort of gave them an idea how severe the situation was, and it also ramped up the organization into getting a very aggressive invasive species control in some of the other parks that they manage. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening, and I'll pass it back over to Ellen.
Excellent. Excuse me. If you have any questions for any of our presenters this evening, you can type those into the chat or into the Q&A window right now, and we'll get to answering those. We do have some questions in already. The first one I wanted to do here was a question from Mike. Mike, in your opinion, which is the best way between cutting weeds and spraying herbicides? Which one would you say is the best way to deal with weeds?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I usually give the typical government extension answer of it depends, right? Which is a bit of a cop out. I mean, here's where my bias comes from. I typically am involved in situations where the weed populations are quite dense. And in those instances, typically herbicides are the most effective way, if they're effective on that weed, to get a population down to a reasonable level where you can manage with other tools. It's going to be plant specific. I actually think, using the example of giant hogweed, which typically isn't in pastures to a great extent, that is one species where I think you could actually do a very effective job of managing it through cutting versus herbicides. It just, the timing is very precise and there's not a lot of wiggle room. So I would probably give a tip of the cap to herbicides because my experience has been they generally are more effective and efficient more quickly at whittling down populations.
Renny or John, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Mike there. I find that sort of the short term, or if you can hit it with herbicide fairly quickly with the right herbicide at the right time, you're looking at longer term control than if you're cutting. So, but cutting can be quite effective, if you don't have access to those herbicides, but you also have to plan to go back multiple years. Whereas if you spray it, if you hit it right, you could maybe knock it out right away. So, I'm spraying in urban areas here. People are very concerned about herbicides and creates a challenge. But quite often when I explain to them, they see me with the sprayer, I explain to them that I'm hoping I could only be here once if I spray, or maybe come back and just do some top ups. So, some people accuse me of being too supportive of herbicides, but if you want to look at an effectiveness approach, I think that, if you have that capability, I recommend spraying if you have that access to it.
I guess for me, it really depends on the particular weed, but if it's something that's not going to be either toxic or noxious to your livestock, grazing management, this high stock density grazing has, I think, a lot of opportunity. But it depends, what if you're able to do that. But it's just such an easy way to do it, and for many cases can be quite effective. It might take 2 or 3 years, but you're also it's a very you're not losing, you're not spending money through that. Hopefully you're actually making money from the gain or the performance from your livestock at the same time.
Okay, question for John. You had mentioned about soil fertility, pH levels. What are some effective and practical ways of adjusting pH levels in the soil to improve soil fertility?
Liming, I guess, if you have a low pH, which I guess in Eastern Canada, where we have our higher rainfalls, tends to be our issue. Our pH, once it starts to go below 6, a lot of especially our more desirable, our commonly grown plants are less effective than some of our more invasive species at accessing the nutrients they need. So adding lime, if you're looking at like a pasture, you might add like a ton of lime or a ton and a half of lime per year over 3 or 4 years, and it'll take a little bit of time to get up there, but it will be effective. If you are in a position that you're plowing, then you can use whatever your soil recommendation would be from a test and be able to add the full amount of lime and incorporate it in, and then get the pH to where you would want it, sort of in that, ideally close to 6.5. 6 is sort of that bare minimum, but it does start to slip down again fairly quickly from that point. So, yeah, lime, I guess, is pretty effective.
Yeah. What is the most effective plant stage to mow or cut absinthe? That may be directed at Renny.
Yeah, I'm dealing with quite a bit of absinthe, and what I find for mowing is if you can catch it just at just as it starts flowering, it'll prevent it from growing and flowering again, hopefully in a year. What I've been finding recently in the last few years, we've been getting some rainfall in, May and June here in Saskatchewan, and then it dries up July, August, no rains, and then we get a flush of rain again in September, and I find that we might get reflowering again, so you may have to watch it, but if you can get it at the time of flowering, it does at least reduce that seed production.
I think this one might be for you as well, Renny. Where can we find information on leafy spurge flea beetle release sites?
Yeah, so in Saskatchewan, if you contact Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, they have plant health officers in Saskatchewan that would help you with the leafy spurge release sites. If you're in Alberta, contact the Alberta Invasive Species Council. They have some information there as well. I'm not sure about other jurisdictions.
Perfect. It's at a lost cause trying to control a certain problem weed on your own property when your neighbor or your municipality is not keeping up with weeds on their end. Is there a way that we can work together more effectively with landowners, your municipality, and other organizations?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's, I guess you have to start somewhere. Deal with the invasives on your property, and maybe develop that relationship with that municipality. Go to council meetings, work with maybe the administrator or the reeve or your counselor. Maybe even get to know your different operators as well, that maybe that patrol the roads or grade the roads and stuff, or mow the ditches. If you're having a hard time developing that relationship, or you're not getting any success, maybe work with different organizations. Like I know some of the watershed groups here in Saskatchewan have developed some really good relationships with municipalities, and you have maybe helped them come along with invasives. I'm a weed inspector for 2 municipalities. Each municipality has a different approach. One municipality is, don't call us, we'll call you type of situation. And they, not necessarily want me out there dealing with invasives. The other municipality has prioritized a couple of species that they want dealt with. And the other ones I've been told, we don't have the budget to control. So it's part of that education factor, and get them involved, maybe get them out on, see what the situation is, or bring in some experts to talk to the council as well. And I think it's part of that education. Depending on the municipality, most of the councillors may be grain farmers, or that don't know the weeds in grain farming, but they don't understand the implications of some of the weeds in a pasture situation. So a lot of it's education and trying to find the right partners.
Excellent. Well, in the interest of time, that will be the end of our questions for tonight. But just a couple of important things before I let you go. One is on how to get more information and science-based production advice through the BCRC. You can go to our website on beefresearch.ca and click the subscribe button to sign up for our free email list. If you've got Twitter, Facebook, or a YouTube account, you can connect with us there as well. You'll also see our next webinar is Calm and Calculated. What key financial tools can help you achieve success on your farm? That will be on November 18th at 7 Mountain Time. You'll also receive an email from me in the next couple of days with a link to watch this recording, as well as a link to some additional information about combating invasive weeds. You'll also receive a link to a survey. If you could take a couple minutes of your time to fill this out, that really helps us with planning future webinars. So that's it. Thanks to you at home for joining us this evening. And on behalf of everyone, thank you to John, Mike, and Renny for volunteering your time to participate in the webinar this evening. And good night.